Welcome back for another exciting episode right here on IT Pro TV. I'm your host, Ronnie Wong, and today we're taking a look at VMware's VCP6. We're going to get a little bit into the idea of replication, and who better to help us than Mr. Don Pizzette. Welcome back to our show.
Ronnie, thanks for having me back on the show, and thanks for stepping in for Wes, who had to be out today.
No problem.
But in this episode, we are going to be tackling vSphere replication, and I know we've seen a little bit of how virtual machines can kind of be bounced between host and host, especially if you had shared storage with things like vMotion. But one of the problems with that solution is that if you have a failure of some sort of the storage, you only had one copy of that VM, right? It was nice they had more than one host that could fire up the VM, but if none of those hosts are able to see the storage, we have a real problem. And so in that scenario, we need a copy of our virtual machine to be stored somewhere else. Maybe another SAN in the same building, preferably a SAN in some other building somewhere else, geographically separated. Well, we don't have a lot of functionality for doing that natively right in vSphere. So what VMware has is a separate product called vSphere Replication that will allow you to take those virtual machines and replicate them somewhere else, their storage and everything. Now, the biggest advantage of shared storage is that you don't have to replicate. That I could have 2 or 10 or 32 hosts that are all able to see the same storage. So if a VM needs to fail over from one piece of hardware to another, I don't have to do anything. The storage is already there. I can already see the virtual disk of that VM. I don't have to do anything. All right. But if I have hosts in different geographic locations, or even in the same location, if the SAN fails, we can't see that storage anymore. So we've got to maintain a copy somewhere else. And whenever you maintain a copy, there's going to be latency, right? Trying to keep 2 storage appliances in lockstep is really, really hard. In fact, the only way I've ever seen that done is if you get 2 SANs from the same vendor. So for example, 2 EMC SANs. You can set up Replistore on those EMC SANs and put them in what's called lockstep. So that when a write happens on one SAN, the write happens simultaneously on the other SAN. And the operating systems don't get a response back until the write is successfully committed on both SANs. If they're sitting right next to each other, plugged into the same fiber channel network, it actually works really well. But if one SAN is at your main office in New York, and the other SAN is at your disaster recovery location in Los Angeles, well, it takes a while to replicate the write from one location to another. So what happens? You slow down. We slow down the writes to be able to handle that replication, and that's a problem. And so that's not really a viable option for most people. So instead, we can leverage VMware's replication feature. And what it does is it says, all right, we're not going to maintain lockstep. That's not going to happen, right? But we're going to try and stay as close as we can. We'll take a virtual machine and we'll clone it. We'll make a copy of its VMDKs and we're going to store those out at this other location. And then while the virtual machine's running, we're going to synchronize changes over. And so as changes occur to the drive, we'll sync them over. We're not going to slow down the VM. We're not going to make it wait for the writes to commit on the remote end. We're just going to take the changes and ship them over. And if you ever have a failure, if you ever lose your storage appliance or your main data center fails, you can flip over to your DR center and they'll already have a copy of the virtual machine storage. It just might be a little out of date. And the question I always get is, how out of date? How out of date are we talking about? And unfortunately, there's not a single answer for that because it depends on 2 things. It depends on, one, the amount of bandwidth that you've got, right? The more bandwidth you have, the more data you can replicate over and the closer you're going to stay to real time. And then the second thing is, how many changes are you making? If this is a web server and it's got a pretty much static web page on it, or a web page you only update once a week or once a month, well, your replica will probably be identical to the real one. And when you fail over from production to disaster recovery, you won't lose any data. But if it's a database server that's constantly getting written to, now we've got a problem. Now the replica is out of date. Okay, so what happens is companies have to evaluate whether the solution is even right for them. If it's a database server, let's just use the example of Amazon, right? Amazon.com, they've got a web storefront, you've probably heard of it, and they process millions of dollars of transactions per hour. So let's say their replica was 15 minutes behind, and they had to fail over to a replica of their database server. For them, losing 15 minutes of orders, I can't even imagine. Ronnie, do you have any idea like what the monetary scale of that is?
I'd assume it's millions.
It's got to be. I guess maybe it depends on the day, right? Black Friday or whatever might be different, but you're talking about a huge financial burden. If they're medical records, right? And for 15 minutes you lose data on a patient, you might lose that they had already been given a dose of some medicine and now they get a second dose. I mean, the liability lawsuits can be crazy. So for that type environment, for database servers, VMware's replication is not going to be the solution for you, okay? But if it's a standard file server, if it's a web server, if it's that kind of system, VMware's replication works out really well. It can create that replica, have it ready to go, and off you go. Now, if you have a database, it doesn't mean you're out of luck, right? Almost every database vendor out there has their own replication system. And so what you're going to do is, say you're running Oracle or Microsoft SQL or MySQL, MariaDB, whatever, is that the majority of them have where you can bring up two database servers in two different locations. They're independent machines in that they have their own name, their own IP address. They're not clones of each other. They're two independent database servers. But then you can create the database and replicate from one to the other. When a database update goes into one, the update gets shipped over to the other one. They call it transaction log shipping. Almost every vendor supports that. And so you can do the replica right from within your database software, and you'll be better off for that, okay? So understand that VMware's replication is not always the perfect solution, but it is a solution and one you should consider. It's also one that's on the exam, so we want to know about it and see how it works, all right? The first thing about VMware replication is that it is not included by default. So when you fire up a vCenter 6 machine, it doesn't have the replication feature, right? You can set up failover VMs, you can set up that kind of thing, but it doesn't have the actual replication feature built in. What we have to do is we have to get the vSphere replication appliance from VMware. So they've got an OVF template that we can download and we can import it in. And what it is a Linux machine. I believe it's running SUSE Linux, and it's pre-configured with all of the vSphere settings that it needs to be able to integrate into vCenter and add the replication services to it. So on the exam, what they want you to know is how to bring in that appliance, which is actually pretty easy. And then once you've got the appliance, how to quickly set up a replica, which is also pretty easy too. So we're going to run through that here in the show. Regardless of whether you use it in real life, we do need to know this for the exam. But I will tell you, for static machines or machines where you can afford a little bit of data loss, vSphere replication is super easy to get set up, and it works really reliably, and it integrates right into vCenter. So it's got a lot of good things going for it. But in a I/O-sensitive operation like a database server, you will want to look elsewhere. All right, so let's take a look at this. Let's see, I've got a little note to talk about failback, but I'll talk about that later after we get this kind of set up. So the first thing I need to do is I need to get vSphere's replication turned on. Okay, now how do I know if I've already got it or not? Well, I've got the vCenter pulled up right here, and if you've already got it, you'll see it with a menu item in here. So I've got policies and profiles, hybrid cloud manager, vRealize orchestrator. I don't have vSphere replication, right? So it's not installed on my system. I can quickly spot that and it's missing. It's kind of like if you watched our VMware data protection or VDP episode, same thing there, right? When we installed VDP, we got a new entry in this menu. That's how the replication will work, right? So what I need to do is I need to go to VMware and download the vSphere replication appliance. If you've purchased the vSphere suite from them, it'll be right in your download center and you can download it. I downloaded it before the show. Now I need to import it. Now, I used to import it right here from the web client because the VMware vSphere web client's upload feature was really easy to use. In newer versions, it's not so easy anymore. So there's a plugin you have to install, and the plugin, it really just doesn't seem to work. But if you're in an environment where it does work, all you have to do is come in here and tell it you want to import a template. So you can go under hosts and clusters, and you can find a host or your data center if you've got a cluster set up, either way. And when you right-click on that host, you'll see deploy an OVF template. And so we can deploy that template right here onto this host and get it up and running. Now, the problem I'm going to bump into is that it's going to tell me the client integration plugin must be installed. And I'll tell you, the client integration plugin is installed on my laptop. It just doesn't seem to work very well on Chrome, or I'm on Vivaldi here, or the other browsers. I haven't really gotten it to work on any modern browser, even though it's supposed to. They say that Firefox gives you the best luck, but I haven't gotten it to work in Firefox either in the newer versions. So when it comes to deploying an OVF template, I almost always jump over to the native client. And so that's what I'm going to do is, I know I use the web client for almost all of this series, But for this one time, I'm going to jump over to the native client. So this is the vSphere native client. It doesn't need plugins, and so we can get it installed really easy. It is done a little bit different. You're going to browse into vCenter and browse into your vCenter server and down to your host. But if you right-click, you'll notice there's not a deploy OVF option. Okay. Instead, it's tucked away under the File menu up top. If you just go up here to File, you'll see Deploy OVF Template. So it's kind of just moved to a different place, and that's why I don't like to use the native client if I can avoid it, because everything's kind of moved around just enough to be annoying. All right, but when we go to deploy it, you can just browse and find it on your hard drive, and what you're looking for is this guy right here, vSphere Replication OVF10.ovf. There's actually two different OVF templates that are available, one for upgrades and one for fresh installs. And so this is the fresh install one. The other one will actually be noted with an upgrade name on it. But if you're just deploying it, this is the one we want. Now the OVF is made up of more than just an OVF file, right? There's a couple of virtual hard drives that come along with it. So let me show you that real quick just to make sure you've seen it. I'll show you what I'm actually importing here. All right, when you download the OVF from VMware, it'll be in an archive file, like a zip file. And these 5 files are what we need, okay? The OVF, that's what I'm about to import. But if you look at it, it's only 300K in size. It's just the configuration template for the VM. You'll also have virtual hard drives. Now the virtual hard drives, if you look at it, there's 2 of them. One's 813 megs, one's 300K, all right? The 813 meg one, that's the one that actually has the Linux install and the replication software. The 300K one, that is a thin provision disk that's going to be where the replica's temporary storage is, and it doesn't have any temporary data right now, so it's actually empty, right? So, but there are 2 hard drives, just one of them happens to be empty. It's more of a placeholder, okay? Then we have our MF and CERT files, and those are for the security of the virtual machine. When we spin it up, it's going to have a little template that we run through, and it's got a certificate to be able to authenticate against it. So these are the 5 files that we need to perform the import. So even though it only shows that one file when I import it, it's got to have all 5 of those. All right, now, because VMware developed this template, they went the extra step and made this one completely customizable right here through the import wizard. So what we're going to get is a really neat screen here in a second where we can define things like what IP address it's going to have and what name we want the VM to have, so you can really customize this one a good bit. I get my certificate screen, and this one is by VMware. Remember with VDP, it was actually from EMC. See how many acronyms I can throw into this thing. So EMC developed the VDP side of things, but Replication was actually developed by the VMware team. And so it's signed, I've got it right here, and there's those 2 disks. It's telling me that the OS drive is going to take about 1.7 gigs and the backup drive is going to take 18 gigs. And notice how it says thick provisioned, right? Well, we saw when we looked at the hard drives a minute ago, neither of them were thick provisioned, right? Because the biggest one I had was 800 megs. So in the template, it's compressed and thin provisioned. But when we deploy it, it's going to do thick provisioned for the operating system and thin provision for the rest of the data. Or actually, I think it's the other way around, thin provision for the OS and thick for the data. So we can still customize that. You can override these. This is just telling you what it's going to be right now. All right. On our next screen, we get our license agreement. I think we've all seen enough of those, so let me just move past it. And now it's going to ask me the important questions. What do I want to name the appliance, and where do I want it to go? All right. Well, I've only got one data center, so that makes my choice easy. You could make the argument that, hey, if I'm going to replicate, I probably want more than one data center, but for right now, we'll leave it right here. So I'm going to go ahead and import that. You can change the name to whatever you want. I'm going to leave mine as vSphere Replication Appliance. And then the CPUs. VMware recommends that when you deploy this, you give it 4 vCPUs. When it does this replication, there's a lot of compression involved. It's compressing and decompressing the data, and CPUs directly impact how quickly it can do that. The faster it can do it, the lower the latency is on your replica. So they recommend 4 or more, all right? Unfortunately, in my lab environment, CPUs are at a bit of a premium, so I'm going to drop that down to 2. It'll let me do it, but it wants more. And I can't choose more than 4 because I've only got 4 CPUs, but if you had 8 or 12, you could choose those higher numbers too. But I'm going to drop mine down to 2. All right. Then it's asking me where I want to store the data. And I've got a couple of different data stores that I can pick from. I'm going to drop mine onto a local data store just so it's a little bit faster. But normally we'd put it on a shared data store so that if one host failed, the replication appliance could jump somewhere else. If the replication appliance goes offline, what's going to happen to our replicas? they're going to stop replicating. They'll still exist. They'll still be over there. I could fail over to them, but they're going to be out of date, right? So I want to have redundancy on the replication appliance itself, and making sure that it's on shared data stores will help you with that. And then you can put it in the cluster and do vMotion and all that other good stuff. But for speed's sake, I'm going to go with a local data store. Then here's where I can override the thin or thick provisioning. So it's asking about my local data store. I've got 500 gigs of space on it right now, and I can do thick provisioned. I'm going to go ahead and do thin provisioned. In real life land, anytime you're in production, you always want to do thick provisioned. So between those, you've got lazy and eager zeroed. Lazy zeroed will thick provision the drive very quickly because it's going to lay out the beginning and end of the disk, and that's it. Eager zeroed is going to go through and try and zero out every sector, and that takes longer. When you thick provision lazy, it's going to zero them out too, but just as you access the disk, so it kind of spreads it out over time versus doing it all right now. It's up to you which one you want to choose. All right, then on the network side. Now, this is a really important one. It's going to ask you to pick which network you're plugging into, and I'm going to plug mine into my VM network. You may have more than one network defined, and if you do, you can pick between them, right? These are our port groups that we define, so you basically pick between which virtual network and port groups you're going to end up on. When you define this, we'll see on the next screen that it's going to ask me for an IP address for my virtual machine, and that's it. It's not going to ask me for a subnet mask or a router or a DNS server. It's not going to ask all those other details that we know it needs. It's not going to ask for them. And the reason is it's going to rely on network properties deployed through a network policy. Somewhere in here it says that. It's warning me about it. You know, it actually doesn't say it. It's just telling me it's expecting us to have an IP pool. What it really needs is a network configuration policy. All right. So if I deploy it right out of the box, the network is probably not going to work on it unless I have a network policy. So we'll check. I don't think I have a network policy on mine, so we'll have to create one. All right, but I'm going to ignore that error for now and just move forward. Then it's going to ask about the IP address. Am I doing DHCP? Am I doing a transient IP that I get when I boot up and then I try and keep? Or am I doing a fixed IP? You almost always want to do a fixed IP on a server. And I'm doing IPv4. It does support IPv6, but I'm going to stick with IPv4. Now it's going to ask me for the password of my system, right? The default user is root, and then I choose what I want the password to be. So I'll get that punched in. A time server. This is really important. Actually, I should have mentioned this earlier. For vSphere replication to work, the time server is super important. How does it recognize whether a virtual machine is out of date or not? How does it recognize what data is new versus old? It's got to have a time server. You've got to have one set. If you don't set a proper time server, vSphere replication actually doesn't work. It will not work. Same thing goes for DNS resolution. It needs to be able to resolve DNS names. So if you've got time problems or if you've got name lookup problems, don't expect vSphere replication to work. So make sure you've got those squared away first. I'm going to use a public time server, but you probably have a private one on your network. I'll just use pool.ntp.org. All right, and then it's asking for a management IP address. Now here's that part I was mentioning where it's not asking for a subnet mask. It's not asking for a default gateway, a DNS server. It's not asking for any of that. We know it needs it, but it's not asking for it. It expects to get it from a policy, which is kind of annoying. I kind of wish they would just put the options in there, but either way, we'll create a policy. All right, last it's asking about whether I want to register the extension with the vSphere web client, which we certainly do. So it's got that vCenter extension vService. We definitely want that. You can choose to select a provider if you have some alternate web management software that you're using. Most people don't, but maybe you've got Veeam or one of those other products that are out there, and you can choose those if they're registered. I only have vCenter, so I'll choose that. And then we can finish that up. Now it's got the option to power it on after deployment. I'm not going to do that because I know the network is broken. I know the network is not going to work. So I'm going to go ahead and finish that, and it's going to deploy it. Okay. Like I say, I know it's not going to work. It could potentially work if I have a network policy. So while that's deploying, let me jump back over to my web client, and I'm going to see if I have one of those policies. All right. Network policies are pretty cool because they provide the information like a DHCP server would, but they can provide it even when you're not using DHCP, so it's a neat thing to have. If I go under networking, and I find my VM network, so here's my VM network, I can go to Manage, and Network Protocol Profile, and IPv4. And I can see I do not currently have a network protocol profile. So that VM is going to boot up. It's got its IP. It knows what it wants, but it doesn't have all the other data. So I need to create a new one. So I'm going to go ahead and whip one up right here to be able to account for that. Now, to make one, what you'll see is way over here, I've got this little chain where it says associate a network profile with the selected network. I'm going to click on that. And I don't have a network profile, so I'm going to create a new one. And so we'll just walk through the wizard to get that created. And we can give it a name. I'm going to call mine my VM network profile. Name it something that you can remember. And then I can give it the subnet mask that it's going to use, right? So, so this is going to be, this is my subnet right here. I need to give it the IP range. So this is going to be in the 192.168.0 network that I've been using, and it's a /24, so I can see the range. I'm going to give it the gateway to use. So there's the gateway that I'm using. If there's a DHCP server, I can tell it, hey, there is one present, you can use it, or I can ignore that. The DNS servers that I want to use, so I can punch those in. And you can separate them by comma or space if you want to add more. I can define an IP pool to give out IP addresses. My VM has a static IP, so I don't actually have to give out any IPs. I really just cared about the DNS server and the gateway. That was really all I cared about. But we can set up a range of IPs if you want. It's got kind of a weird notation. Notice this little hash mark that it uses. And basically what you're doing is you're specifying the first IP, and then you do a hash mark and how many IPs after that you want to assign. So maybe I want to do 10 IPs. So this would be 220 through 230, and you can define it that way. All right. After that, if you're doing IPv6, you can define those. I didn't do IPv6, so I'm just going to skip over that one. Oh, wait, did I hit? Oh, there we go. There's this little check mark here, enable IP pool. That's kind of important, right? If we don't check that, this whole thing doesn't work. So I need that turned on. In IPv6, I was just making sure that I hadn't checked that. Then anything else we want to provide, if we have DNS domain, so we've been using lab.itpro.tv. If we've got a host prefix for the host name, you can specify that, DNS search path, and an HTTP proxy. I don't need any of that, so we'll go ahead and finish that up. And now I've got a profile. And what's important is when that virtual machine comes on, it's got an IP, and now it'll be able to get subnet mask, default gateway, DNS server, all those other information, just like you could from a DHCP server. All right, and my screen is taking its time to refresh, so let me just manually refresh this. And I want to make sure, there it is, that policy shows up, and there it goes. Okay, so we should be good to go now when that virtual machine is ready. Let's go check on our VM. All right, looks like our VM is deployed, so I can see it right here, vSphere Replication. And I don't need the native client anymore. If I go back to my web client, I should be able to go to my home page and go under VMs and templates, and there's the vSphere Replication right there. Okay, now I'm not done. You probably noticed back on the home page that I don't have replication showing up here yet, and that's because I haven't even powered on the machine, and there is a little wizard that we need to run through. So I'm going to go and pull that machine up, and we'll go ahead and power the thing on. So we can see it's turned off right now, so I'm going to power that one on. And if I screwed up my network policy, I'll see a little warning appear here when it tells me that it's not configured right, but it should come up and see the network and have the other information that it needs. So I'm just going to give it a moment while it does that. Let me refresh my screen. There we go. So it's booting in the background, and I'm going to have to relaunch this console, so let me do that. There we go, and it's booting up, okay? It does boot Linux. It's completely configured by VMware though, so you don't need to know a single thing about Linux. It's gonna boot up, and when it's done, it's gonna be ready for us to start managing it, so we just need to give it a moment while it does that. And as soon as it registers in with our vCenter deployment, then it's gonna be connected, and we'll be able to configure everything else right from our native vSphere web client, so that'll be kind of convenient. So it does take a moment. See how it says waiting for mandatory services ETH0, right? So it's booting my Ethernet adapter, and it's looking for those settings that come from the network configuration profile. And so as soon as that's done, it'll move forward and continue the boot. The first boot can take a little while. I had a few failures there, but they went by so fast I couldn't see it. But I did for a brief moment there see the IP address, and it did have the subnet mask, and it did have DNS. So we'll just need to make sure we don't have any errors after it fully boots. A lot of times those errors are just indicating that the drives aren't ready, and it's about to get the drives ready for us. See how it's generating a certificate? It's still doing work during this first boot. So don't freak out if you get a few errors. You might just need to wait. All right, so that one is almost done. I know it kind of seems like it's just sitting here idling, but it took it a moment to generate that SSL certificate, and now it's applying that SSL certificate and running a few other scripts, and all we see is this little cursor just kind of sitting here. But there we go. VM reconfiguration results success. You know, it's going through and it is doing things, and we just need to wait. This is the hardest part for me, Ronnie, is just the patience needed. But we'll give it a moment. And as soon as it's done, if I remember right, it does do one more reboot. We'll see here in a minute. And then it should be ready to rock. So we'll give it a chance to do that.
Now, Don, you had mentioned earlier about failover, but you were going to come back and address that. Is that a good time to talk about it now, or do you want to wait?
Yeah, while we're waiting on this. So the neat thing about vSphere replication is that it can set up where you have a VM running in one location and it replicates it somewhere else. That's great. And if the primary one fails, you can automatically flip over to the other one, or you can manually flip over to the other one, right? So that's called failover. But what happens if there's a failure? Your main data center goes down, so you fail over to the other side, and then you fix your main data center. Your main data center comes back online. Well, that's where you need to do what's called failing back, okay? Well, vSphere replication does not support failing back. It only supports fail over, not fail back, okay? And the reason for that is once you've failed over, changes are happening on the other side. When you restore your primary site, it's now the one that's out of date. You don't want to fail back to a system that's out of date, right? That would not be good. So it doesn't do it. So if you fail over, the way you fail back is you delete the replica settings, right? The replication settings, you delete those, and then you recreate them in the other direction where you replicate from DR back to production. So now production is like the backups. Now we're replicating that way. And once they're in sync, then you fail over back into production. Now you're not done, right? Because once you're back in production, you've got to delete the replica again and put the replication back in place, going back the other direction to replicate it back out again. So you end up with 3 different replication settings. The original ones when you failed over, the new ones to get you to fail back, and then a third one to put everything back to the way that it used to be where you're replicating from production to DR. So it's a little bit quirky, but it puts you in control of when you fail back, and you need that. When you failed over, you need that. All right, the virtual machine did finish, and it's displaying the screen that most of us will leave our appliance setting on. It's got a nice little note here letting me know that if I want to manage this device, I need to browse to this IP. And here's the IP in my system, which is 205, and then the port number, which I'm going to write down here because I always forget this one, just so I've got it. So I can browse right to that address to get this thing set up. And so that's exactly what I'm going to do. I'm going to browse to 192.168.0.205:5480. And we're going to browse to that web page. I'm getting a warning because I don't trust that certificate, but I'm going to go ahead and do it anyway. And now we get where we can get logged in to this system. I'm going to provide it the username root, because that's the default username, and the password that I defined when we did the install, okay? And it's going to take us right here to the configuration for our appliance, right? I don't have to know Linux, because it's all done right here through the nice GUI. And you can jump into your configuration, and we can tweak things like the IP address, the names, any of that stuff that we defined before. We can go in and we can change. Right now it's getting it from the embedded database, but you can do a manual configuration if you want. You can tweak your security and your support. You can also update the appliance, right? Instead of downloading the OVF templates from VMware, you can just update it right from here, and that makes life a little bit easier for us too, right? So one thing that you'll notice that's missing from here is, where do I set up the replicas, right? I've got this appliance, that's great. Where do I set up the replicas? Well, we've set up one piece, right? We've set up this VMware replication server that's attached to vCenter. Now we need to replicate to somewhere else, right? And we do that right from the vSphere web client. So I'm going to jump back to my vSphere web client and go back to my home page. And once this is registered, we'll have some new options that are available in here. Now, if they don't show up right away, you might need to log out and log back in. But let me just jump into a VM and see if I've got them there. So I've got this client sitting right here, WinClient01. And assuming that everything is in place like it should be, you can right-click on that, and you'll see your menus pop up. And we can find our replication settings in here, which actually, looking at it, I am not seeing mine, unless I just glanced over it too fast. We've got clone, which is not replication, fault tolerance, which is the native stuff, and yep, not showing up. All right, so I'm going to need to log out, and once I log out of this thing and log back in, that kind of refreshes it, because remember that the vSphere Replication has a plugin that's registered, and that plugin is just not loaded right now, so I need to get that piece. There's a few other spots where you can see it show up if you've got it installed, but in my case, it's just not here yet. Now, if you're like me and you're impatient, there is a way we can kind of give it a little kick in the butt here and get it moving on faster, so I'm going to do that. You shouldn't have to do this if you just wait long enough. It should register on its own, but if not, we can go back to that vSphere Replication webpage, and if you go under configuration, it's got right here where you can set your SSO password, right? And so we can define that to get it to connect to vCenter, and you can manually start the VRM service to get that thing kicked in. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come in and punch in my vCenter password there, and I'm going to start it up. Now, what this is going to do is it's going to force it to register right now. You've got to register with vCenter, and you'll see over here I've got the unregistered VRMS, so it already thinks that it's registered, but it's just not showing up. So I'm going to punch in that password, and actually here, we'll do save and restart. And then if that service still doesn't start on its own, we'll start it after that. So now what I'm doing is just kind of watching this little note down here where it says VRM service is stopped. And when this page refreshes, if that's not started, then I'll start it. And oh, actually, you know what? We may not have registered. I'm getting a certificate warning because I'm using self-signed certificates instead of an actual CA environment. And so that may have stopped it from registering in the first place. I may have had a problem there. So we'll go ahead and accept that certificate, though. That'll get it past that. And so here it's verifying that SSL certificate. And we'll give that just a second. And this should make it register right now. And what I'm hoping to see is that service get started, and then it should show up in my main portal. Now, back here in the main portal, I'm going to go ahead and just log out in anticipation of this one. So we'll log out of that. And then jump back over here. I'm just kind of waiting for this thing to finish. We got our spinning wheel of doom. While we're waiting on that, let me throw out a little factoid that might show up on the exam. I mentioned earlier that when we're replicating, it can compress our data. A couple little caveats about that. The way that the replication works is actually using snapshots. It takes a snapshot of your VM, and then the changes are being written to a snapshot file, and it's replicating the snapshot file across. That way it kind of minimizes the amount of data it's got to replicate. So that's kind of how it's working behind the scenes. But the other thing is, it works with many different versions of ESXi, but if you want compression, for compression, you've got to have ESXi version 6 and vSphere Replication version 6. That's where they introduce compression. So if we're still dealing with ESXi 5.5 machines, or if you have vSphere Replication that's an older version, you may not have compression, and now it's moving the full data set. Compression takes more CPU, but takes less bandwidth, so it can be an ideal way to go about things. All right, I thought I'd be able to, well, actually we can see a few things. So looking at my screen down here, I see VRM service is running now. I didn't click start, it did it on its own, but up here I can see that it's still starting up the VRMS. It should be registered though, so let's go log in and see if we can get that stuff showing up in here. So I'm going to do vSphere admin, or wait, we want to log in as administrator at vSphere local, and I'll punch in my password. And what I'm hoping to see here is on my home page, I should have my replication icon anytime now. See, in real life land, you have the advantage of patience, but I'm staring at a timer, so I'm somewhat limited. So looking at mine, shoot, still not seeing it. We just have to wait, so impatient. All right, there it says that it is loaded now. And I might have to log out again because I'm just not waiting. Yeah, let me do it again, darn it. Sometimes you just can't win. All right, so I'm going to log out and log back in, and we should have it. And sometimes I've seen where if it doesn't show up on that home page, it does show up on the individual VM's action menu, so we might be able to pull it up there too. But what we should see is an icon right there on our home page for replication, and that's not actually the one we want to use, because that really just takes you to the web pages that we've already seen. What we want to do is we want to go to a VM and activate it. Activating replication and failing over and stuff is really super easy. What you do is, we've just set up one replication appliance. You'd set up a second one wherever your destination network was. If the destination network was right here, we could get away with one, but usually it's going to be some remote location. So you stick a replication server there too. When they're both registered, now you've got a source and a target. And from there, you just go through your individual VMs and activate replication. You specify that target, and it starts replicating. You got to have an appliance on the other end because it's managing the decompression as well as creating the virtual machines and so on. All right, so let's go see if this is going to show up on my VMs now. If not, we might have to use the magic of TV to just wait this one out. But if I right-click on that VM, what I'm expecting to see is my replication options show up, and yeah, they're still not there. So, all right, here's what we're going to do. We're going to leverage the magic of television to just wait patiently and try and achieve a state of Zen. Usually this takes about 5 to 10 minutes. For me, I think I've stalled about 10 minutes now, so it's kind of a little bit longer than we normally see. But let's just wait this one out, and as soon as that shows up, we'll be able to jump right in there and get that configuration kind of set up, and that'll wrap up replication for us. All right, ladies and gentlemen, well, thanks to the magic of filmmaking, we are now an amazing, almost 20 minutes into the future as we waited on this plugin to register, but it did finally register and is showing up in my UI, so let me show you what that looks like. You'll know that your vSphere replication device is registered if you see this icon right here, vSphere replication. That's what I was waiting on. And over on the left side, you'll see I've got this new vSphere replication item right there. You may need to log out and log back in. You may need to refresh your screen. You may need to just go and grab a cup of coffee and wait, which is ultimately what I did before that shows up. But I know that vSphere replication is now showing up. The next step is simply to turn it on for your virtual machines. So now you go through and configure each VM that you want to get configured. Now remember, we do need to have a second replication server somewhere else. I've only got one, so it's going to be unhappy about that. But you deploy a second replication server in your other location where you've got a separate vCenter environment, right? These replication servers are going to link those two vCenter environments together. So now I can just go in and pick my VMs. I probably don't want to replicate all my VMs, right? We've got critical ones versus non-critical ones. So for the critical VMs, I'm going to come in here and find them. And let me just take my client here. So here's WinClient01. So let's say I want to replicate this guy. I'll right-click on it, and in my options, if I scroll down way at the bottom, you'll see all vSphere replication actions. And if you scroll over, there's only one action, configure replication. So that's the one that I want. I'm going to click on that, and it's going to fire up the wizard. Now it's going to ask where we want to replicate it to, and you've got two choices. We can replicate it to a vCenter server. That's normally what we want. We've got another vCenter environment over on our disaster recovery location, and that's where we want to replicate it to. But you do have this other option, replicate to a cloud provider. What is that? Well, we haven't talked about it, but VMware has a service called vCloud Air. And vCloud Air is where they host your virtualization environment for you. It's kind of like Amazon Web Services or Microsoft Azure, but it's VMware that's running it. Now, depending on when you watch this show, vCloud Air may or may not be out of business. And so I say that jokingly, but in real life land, VMware's laid off most of their vCloud Air staff. So it does show up on the exam as a service that they offer, but they might not be offering it by the time you get there.
Reality.
But that's what that is we could actually replicate up there. And it's a great way to migrate your virtual machines from on-premises up to a cloud. And you can create a hybrid environment, linking your local vCenter environment with vCloud Air up at VMware's environment. Obviously, you've got to sign up for a subscription and open up a business account with them and do all that to get that in place, but that is a neat way to do it. But I'm going to choose to replicate to a vCenter server, and this is where things are going to get a little hairy for me because I don't have a second one. So as we move forward, it's going to ask me to pick a target site. And here's where I would need to pick not the vCenter server that I'm already on, but the other vCenter server that's registered to replicate to so we can send it across. And I'll have to pick the replication server at that location. So as I move forward, I'll see the server. So here's my vSphere replication appliance, and I can choose it. I've got 0 replications right now, and that's important because the more replications that one server is handling, the more latency you introduce. So if this is a really low latency replica I need to maintain, I want to keep this number low. But if they're non-critical servers, I might have 20 or even 30 VMs all replicating through this one appliance because I'm not so worried about the latency. It's up to me to determine that. Then we choose our target location. The target location is going to be the other data center that we're going to deploy into. I've only got the one. So when I look at it, I've got WinClient01, and right now it's being stored just in its default location, and I need to edit that to pick where it's going to go to. So this is where I would pick the data store at the remote location. Right now my data is in one of these data stores. I can't remember which one, but I'll choose one of them here. I would preferably choose a data store that's in the other location to do it, right? And so you're going to pick that. It'll show you what's in the data store right now, and that's where we're going to be replicating to. All right, so now that it's got the data store set, that's where it's going to store the entire clone of our virtual machine to make sure that we're ready there. You do have a few replica options that you can set right here, like enabling quiescing. Whenever you take a snapshot remember that we can quiesce the hard drives. We can slow down any write operations that are happening to make sure that the hard drive is clean when we take our snapshot. Or we could choose not to do that. The drive will stay running at full speed the whole time, but you could have partial write operations that are now a part of that snapshot, and we may not want that. So we can choose to turn that on or off. And then network compression. Remember I mentioned compression can really reduce the bandwidth that we need, but it requires us to have ESXi 6, vCenter 6, and vSphere Replication 6. So if we're at all version 6, that works out great and we can turn it on. I'm going to leave it off for now. In real life, I'd turn it on, but in my lab, it makes things run a little bit on the slow side. All right, then we get our recovery settings. Now, the recovery settings are kind of important. Here's where we're trying to gauge what level of latency is acceptable for us, our recovery point objective, okay? And notice that the default RPO is 4 hours. That means we could have up to 4 hours of latency and it would be okay as far as this system is concerned. That may not be okay for us. You can crank that up, but notice the lowest level we can choose, 15 minutes. VMware will not guarantee more than or less than 15 minutes of latency between your actual VM and the clone that it's making. And the reason is it's got to take a snapshot and then replicate that data, and that just takes time. You can't achieve it in a smaller window. If you need something even smaller than this, that's what I was talking about at the beginning of the episode. vSphere replication might not be the solution. You might need to deal with replication built into your database software or whatever software it is that you're using. I'm going to leave mine at 4 hours. I'm going to try. There we go. You also have point-in-time instances down here. This is where we have a replica, but it maintains the snapshots so that when we fail over, we can fail over to the snapshot at any given point in time, not just the most recent one. Usually when you fail over, you want the most recent one. But maybe you had a server get infected or somebody hacked into it, right? So I want to fail over to the other one, and I don't want the most recent one because it's been hacked into, right? That's replicated over. I want to go back an hour to before the hack happened, right? So having a point-in-time instance helps you with that, and you can choose how many of those instances to maintain because each one is a snapshot. They take up hard drive space. You may not want tons of these laying around. It's up to you to pick how many you want. Once that's done, the replication is set up, we're pretty much in business. We can finish that up. It is complaining a little bit because my virtual machine is turned off right now. But when I finish that, it's going to set up that replication. And now we're pretty much in business, right? Pretty easy to get that up and going. Now I'm replicating to 2 different storage locations in my own network. This is how I would set it up if I had 2 SANs and I wanted my data stored on the 2 different SANs. This isn't going to give me locational replication. I really need to have a second location with a second replication server, and now I can really get that redundancy in place, right? But this certainly works if I'm just trying to get redundancy between 2 SANs locally. All right. Once you've got replication set up, don't just set it and forget it, right? There's a few little things that we have to do. When you right-click on that instance and go down to all vSphere replication actions, you'll see you have a lot more actions now, right? You can pause the replication, you can stop it, you can force it to sync now. You can also cause it to fail over. Now, I can't cause mine to fail over now because the first replica hasn't completed. But once it completes the first replica, you'll have the option to fail over, and now the replica becomes the primary, right? And remember, we can only fail over, we can't fail back. So if it comes time to fail back, what we need to do is stop synchronization and then reconfigure it and reconfigure it the other direction. Replicate back, fail over, and then stop it one more time and redo the replication in the original direction to get things put back the way they were. One last thing I want to show you guys on replication. If I go back to my home page and we go down here to vSphere replication, you'll get your getting started information, and right down here you'll see monitoring and managing replication. And so you can jump right in there, and VMware has some great articles out there about how you can monitor replication to make sure that it's working the way that you intend it to work, because there are some tweaks and tuning that you may need to do to get it running efficiently in your environment. So definitely check that out. The other thing is, when you browse into your server and browse into the VM, you'll see it under the monitoring for the VM too. So there's a few different ways that we can get in there and actually see what's going on, right? If we browse in here and pick our server, so I'll take Win Server 01, I'm gonna jump over to Monitor. Under the Monitoring tab, we'll have a little bit in here as far as tracking that replication. So I'm just drilling down. I went into my vCenter server, I went to Monitor, I then went to the vSphere Replication tab. That's a new tab that appeared after this was registered. And over here I can see incoming and outgoing replications. And you can see if they're active. My VM's not on, so it's not active right now. And then I can see where it's coming from, where it's going to, and all that additional information right in here. If there's point-in-time replicas, they would show up here. And I can initiate recovery right from here. It's all done right via the vCenter panel, which is nice. You have one administration tool that you go to. Everything you need is right there. All right, well, Ronnie, I think that's a pretty good rundown of vSphere Replication. For the exam, they really want you to know how to set up that appliance and how to get it registered in. They don't really delve too much deeper into it, but you do need to be aware that it's available, and it's not that hard to get set up. It requires more patience than I have, to be honest, but other than that, it really does run well.
Well, thank you, Don, for helping us to understand vSphere Replication a little bit more and how to configure it. Really, in this episode, that's what we took a look at here. The idea of understanding that vSphere Replication is a separate product besides what we normally actually are seeing, and so we do have to import it in or get it registered in the way that we need to. And then Don also showed us the configuration and, of course, even how we begin to get our VMs replicated the way that we want, and then we also took a look at some recovery options there as well. So take a look at these options. Don't just assume that you actually know what's going on here. Take some time to do it. You'll actually see that it will take a little bit of time getting everything registered and set up the way that you want. Bit of frustration, great time to have a little cup of coffee in between, and then get back to it, and you'll see everything will actually come up. Don, any other advice before they go in to take this for this replication idea?
That's about it. You can mess around with it in your own labs and try it out and experiment with it. It is a great solution. It does work really well, but a lot of people do find alternative methods that work out and achieve the same thing. So just remember that. Don't assume you have to go with the VMware method. It's nice because it's integrated right here into the panel, but it's not the only solution that's out there.
That's a great place for us to wrap up then. Signing off for IT Pro TV, I'm your host, Ronnie Wong.
And I'm Don Pizzette.
And we'll see you next time.